This is video 3.1, and the goal in this video is to be able to solve quadratic equations. Now remember, a quadratic equation is any equation that has an x squared in it. So we often write them as the following. Ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So x's are unknowns, and a, b, and c are numbers. So it could be 2x squared plus 3x minus 4 equals 0, and that's a quadratic. Remember, there are up to 2 solutions for a quadratic. There's 2 x's that might make that true, or there may be 0 x's. There may be no solution. So we want to keep that in mind, that we're looking for up to 2 answers, 2, 1, or 0 answers. So let's take a look at a couple of things here. So what is a quadratic? It's a single variable equation where the highest power is x squared. So I just talked about the ax squared bx plus c. Notice this one is similar. It has the x squared and the x term. They just don't happen to be on the same side. The second thing that we need to know is how do we solve these? You have 2 strategies you should have learned in class. One of them is the quadratic formula, and the other is the zero product property. So quadratic formula, it requires you to first rearrange everything and make it look like the following, everything equal to 0. And then remember your a, b's, and c's, you plug into this formula. And we'll talk through one of those examples here. The another option is to rewrite it as a product. So if we can write this guy right here, we still want it equal to 0. And if we can rewrite it as a product, remember a product equal to 0, then remember we break it up and we split it into 2 equations. Either a equals 0 or b equals 0. Or in this case, so either this parenthesis equals 0 or this equals 0. And we'll talk through one of those as well before you try these on your own. So these are the 2 options, quadratic formula or zero product property. So let's take a look at the first example. 2x squared minus 5x equals 7. So our goal here is to solve this quadratic. And the first step to solving is always to make one side equal to 0. That's always the first step. So I'm going to start with subtracting 7 from both sides, so I get 0 on the right-hand side over here. I'll get 0 equals 2x squared minus 5x minus 7. So I've written it in a standard form for solving, whether I'm using the formula or I'm factoring. And the second step is exactly what we talked about with the strategies. You either factor and use the zero product property or use the quadratic formula. So I have that there in case we want to use that. So let's see. We first try factoring because usually we're pretty good at factoring. So we start with our generic rectangle. We fill in what we know. We know those go in those corners. Then we use our diamond problem. Our diamond problem, the product is negative 14x squared, because that's what the product would be here. And the sum is negative 5x, because that is the number of x's I need. So it multiplies to negative 14, so that means 1 is negative and 1 is positive, and it adds to negative 5. Let's see, a way to multiply to negative 14 is 7 times 2. So negative 7 and positive 2, and of course they're both x's. So now I know what goes in my diamond problem, and then I figure out what goes on the outside. Let's see, 2x squared has to be 2x and 1x, and the 2, that makes that a 1, and that makes that a minus 7. So I've rewritten this original equation that was listed here. I can rewrite that as a product of 2x minus 7 times x plus 1. That's equal to what was in red up here. So these are equal quantities here. So I've just rewritten it as a product. Now remember, we use our zero product property. So now we break it apart and we say, well, since the product equals 0, then 2x minus 7 equals 0, or x plus 1 equals 0. I bet many of you remember finding one solution, sometimes finding solutions in your head. Ask yourself, what x could I plug in here for this x to make the value 0? And that x would be negative 1. So negative 1 is one of your solutions, because negative 1 plus 1 is 0. This one's a little harder to see, the second solution, 2x minus 7. So I'm going to solve for x, figure out when it's 0. And I'm going to get 2x equal to 7. And one more step, and I'll have my x value. Divide by 2, x is 3.5. So these are my two solutions to this quadratic. So that was the factoring idea. If we factor it, and then we use the zero product property. So we have to have it equal to 0 in order to do that. Let's take a look at another example. Remembering our two steps to solve, make one side equal to 0, and then factor or use the formula. So we are starting with getting it all equal to 0. So I'm gonna minus the 5x. I'm gonna minus the 1 from both sides. I can do that at the same time if I want to. I get 0 on the right, and I get 3x squared minus 5x minus 1. Now my goal is to factor or use the zero product property or a quadratic formula. So I always test out factoring real quick because I'm better at that than the formula, and I try to factor. These numbers look small, so I think factoring might be possible and might be easy to do. We'll see. So let's see, it has to multiply to negative 3x squared, and it has to add to negative 5x squared. Now, by the way, if I'm going too fast for you, pause the video, set up your generic rectangle, get your factoring set up, and even try it by yourself, because most of us are pretty strong at factoring. So try the factoring by yourself and then restart the video and see if you come up with the same solution. So let's see, multiplies to negative 3, there's only one way, two ways, and that's 3 times negative 1 or negative 3 times 1, since 3 is a prime number. So neither of those will work. Neither of those will add to negative 5x. So it seems like my factoring is not going to be the method for me. I'm going to use the quadratic formula. When factoring does not work, you use the quadratic formula. The first step is, remember, to always figure out who's A, who's B, and who's C. Since we solved it for 0 already, we can see our A, B's, and C's. Remember, A is the number of x squared, so in our case, 3. We have 3x squareds. The answer is not 3x squared. It's simply the number of x squareds. So the number 3 is the only number you need for A. There are 3 x squareds in your problem. That's why we just use 3, not with the x's. B is the number of x's, because remember, this is the way the formula works. ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So b is the number of x's, the number in front of the x, and that happens to be negative 5. It's very important to keep that negative on there because it's being subtracted. And then c is negative 1 because it's the number being added or subtracted at the end. And negative 1 is over here. So I figured out who A, B, and C are. Now I'm going to plug them into my formula carefully. Okay, and hopefully you've been, really big suggestion if you make mistakes is to use parentheses when you plug in numbers. So when I read the top part of this fraction, I see the opposite of B. So I'm going to put a negative sign in front of the 5. So let's see, x equals the opposite of B. Okay, I'm plugging B in with parentheses wherever I see B. Plus minus the square root of b squared, so negative 5 squared, minus 4 times a, so I'm in parentheses again, because I want to be careful, times c. So to be extra careful, you enter every number with parentheses. And on the outside is the stuff that was originally in the problem. The 4 was on the outside. The squaring is on the outside. Those two things are on the outside because they were in the original problem, the formula. And then this is all over 2 times a. Again, the a is in parentheses. So now how do we tackle this? We got a lot of numbers here. Number one thing you want to do is first find your determinant, they call that fancy thing with the square root. So that's the first thing that we're going to do. We're actually going to calculate what that value is. So we're going to find out what negative 5 squared is. We can use a calculator, we can use our heads, whatever we need. I'm also going to quickly do this because 2 times 3 is 6. Then I have less to write every time because that's going to be the last step is going to be subtracting, is going to be divided by 6. I'm also going to do this first because I can quickly clean that up. The opposite of negative 5 is 5. Plus or minus the square root of, so now I'm going to do the stuff on the inside one step at a time. Negative 5 squared is 25 because a negative times a negative is a positive. Minus 4 times 3 times negative 1. 4 times 3 is 12, times negative 1 is negative 12. So far I have the determinant almost figured out. And now I'm going to figure out the full answer on the inside of that radical, on the inside of this square root here. So 25 minus negative 12, remember that's the same as adding positive 12. So that can be rewritten as 5 plus or minus the square root of 25 plus 12, which is 37, all over 6. So my last couple steps here are to take the square root. So at this point, I actually want to do the top and the bottom. I want to do the top operation, 5 plus the square root of 37. So I'm going to start and separate this. Now remember, this is how we get our two answers. This plus minus means one answer is going to be 5 plus the square root of 37 divided by 6. And the other answer is 5 minus the square root of 37 divided by 6. So now I'm going to have to use my calculator because I don't know what the square root of 37 is in my head. So I'm going to punch that into my calculator and I get about 6.1. So 5 plus 6.1 divided by 6 and 5 minus 6.1 divided by 6. And now I'll just do the simple math. 11.1 divided by 6 is 1.85. And 5 minus 6.1 is negative 1.1. Oops, 1.1 divided by 6 is negative 0.8183. Excuse me. So here are our two solutions. Those are the two answers that you need to give on the test. You're looking for those two solutions that make that quadratic true. And if we were to plug these in, we would get the same answer. So the two answers are x equals 1.85 or negative 1.183. So the biggest trick with quadratic formula is just being careful and taking your time. Don't rush through it or you'll make some mistakes. But always, always, always try to factor first, like we did up here. Okay, remember we factored up there and it helped us see that we have to use the formula. And then you use the formula and make it work. Just do it really slowly and be really careful. So your goal is to solve these quadratics. Think through the steps. Sometimes one step has already been done for you or maybe 2 steps have been done for you. Okay, but look at steps 1 and 2 and try to follow them and work through these problems. When you're finished or as you're working, make sure you ask your teacher if you're not sure if you're doing it right to check your answers. And you'll have a concept check at the end of this to see how you did and if you can do this correctly after a little bit of practice and review. So good luck and make sure to ask lots of questions.